Welcome everyone. As you're joining, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and drop in your name and the city and state that you live in and the name of your congregation or state affiliate. If you have one, we'd love to get to know one another through the chat. And again, I want to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Reverend Susan Hendershot, and I serve as the president of Interfaith, Power, and Light. And I want to just go through a couple of housekeeping items for you. First of all, just to let you know that attendees are muted during this webinar, and you will not be able to unmute yourself. So we want to encourage you to use the chat to make any comments, and also to use the Q&A feature to ask questions for our panelists. We'll be having some time for attendee questions later on in this webinar. And if you're not familiar with the Q&A function, you can find that at the very bottom. You'll see the chat function in the middle, and to the right of that, you'll see Q&A, and that's where you can drop your questions in for later. So first, I want to do a land acknowledgement for us as we begin this evening. And I want to acknowledge that where I am here in Virginia, as in every part of our country, we are on Indigenous land. I recognize that I live and work within the ancestral lands of the Manahoac people, and I acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these peoples, and I'm grateful for their stewardship of this land. And I invite you to place in the chat the name of the people whose land you rely upon now. If you're not sure where to find that, we're dropping a link into the chat for you where you can look that information up and identify the Indigenous land you live and the peoples that you are dependent upon. So as I said, my name is Reverend Susan Hendershot, and I serve as the president of Interfaith, Power, and Light. And our mission is to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. And I have three very special guests with me this evening, and I'm very excited to introduce all of them to you. It's undoubtedly, you already know them, but I'm going to introduce them to you anyway. So our first guest this evening is William Barber III. He serves as the Director of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Climate Reality Project, and he leads the organization's work on environmental and climate justice, bringing a background of scholarship and policy advocacy to bear. His background includes a degree in environmental physics from North Carolina Central University and a degree in environmental law and policy from UNC School of Law, both of which he has utilized in driving results-based change for impacted communities over nearly a decades-long career of social justice organizing focused on environmental and climate justice issues. William is a fellow of environmental justice and civic engagement at the Center for Earth Ethics, and is also founder and CEO of the Rural Beacon Initiative, LLC, a multi-member startup that provides consultation for groups looking to advance equity, climate justice, and environmental justice. His work on community solutions has been featured in numerous outlets, including NextGen's 30 Under 30 Young Black Changemakers and in PayPal's Rising Leaders series. So welcome, William. We're glad to have you with us this evening. Our next guest is Mary Novak, who is the Executive Director of Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. And she began serving as Executive Director of Network in April of 2021. She is a lawyer, educator, chaplain, and spiritual director, restorative justice practitioner, and activist who has worked in Catholic contexts for decades. Prior to leading Network, Mary served as a mission integrator and adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown Law Center in Washington, D.C. Mary studied theology and spirituality at SCU and Washington Theological Union, earning a Master's of Arts in Pastoral Studies. She has served pastorally, including as a spiritual director in hospitals and universities for 2 decades. From 2014 to 2020, Mary served as the founding chair of the board of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, which is part of the Congregation of St. Joseph Mission Network, and she continues to serve as board secretary. Mary's leadership helped grow CMN into a strong and stable nonprofit working to end the use of the death penalty and promote restorative justice. So Mary, we're so happy to have you with us tonight. And Gayla Tillman, our third panelist, serves as a policy associate for Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Gayla is an organizer born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. They hold a degree in Africana Studies from Georgia State University and have taught trainings and helped host events centering an array of social justice issues. In Gayla's former role at Georgia Conservation Voters, they were the civic engagement organizer. They worked at the intersection of environmental justice and civic engagement to work towards energy equity and justice, clean water, and accessible climate solutions. As policy associate for Georgia IPL, Gayla is working to make policy creation and decision-making more accessible to people of color, working class people, and people of marginalized gender. Gayla, we're really happy to have you here with us this evening. So welcome to all of you. And I also just quickly want to introduce IPL's Faith Climate Justice Voter Campaign Manager, Mike Kennedy. Mike will be compiling questions for our attendees for the Q&A session, and he'll be joining us a little later in our time together. So thank you, Mike. And thank you to both Mike and Tiffany Hartung from IPL staff for putting this webinar together for us this evening. So this week, IPL released a multi-issue faithful voter reflection guide to help educate and inform people of faith and conscience about issues that are at stake in the 2022 elections. Every election year is significant, and this year is certainly no exception. The outcome will impact our nation's response to climate change and its many intersecting issues for years to come. As people of faith and conscience across the country, we believe that elections are a referendum on the values that will shape our future. Using our voices to fulfill our civic duty and vote in every election makes a difference in our communities and in our world. Your vote is how you can speak up for our common home and our neighbors, and it's how we create a society based on our shared values. That's why we released this multi-issue faithful voter reflection guide. IPL is distributing this guide to people of faith and conscience because the time is ripe to be examining how our spiritual and religious beliefs can and should be serving the greater good. Centering our core values of justice, courage, and hope, we seek to live out our love for the sacred, for one another, and for the earth. We need elected leaders who share our values. We know that if we want a country that reflects our highest values, we have to participate thoughtfully in elections. It is our hope that this guide will stimulate the kinds of conversations that people of faith and conscience need to be having in order to renew our democracy. Whether you use it at the kitchen table, in a house of worship, at a community forum, or at an event with political candidates, we hope it helps you and your community navigate the urgent moral questions facing our nation. The issues we address here are not exhaustive, but we believe they provide a framework for evaluating issues and candidates in a way that prioritizes solutions that promote dignity and the common good. So I want to turn to our wonderful panelists now for some conversation about the guide and about some of these issues and about elections and voting. And so, William, I'm going to start with you. I want to ask you, what do you think is at stake for God's creation and our sacred earth in this election?
Thank you, Susan, for that question. And thank you, for to all of my panelists for joining us, for this really critical conversation. I think we have to have a robust understanding of where we actually are in this moment in history, meaning that we have to fully recognize how transitory this moment is. We are at a societal crossroads. I would even say a tipping point for a number of monumental societal issues. I frame them in three: the crisis of climate, the crisis of democracy, and the crisis of poverty. And the reality is, if we continue on the current path of not addressing these issues fully, there may not be many more generations with an opportunity to take ownership of their future. We face a devastation that may not be recoverable, and immoral decisions that are currently being made by people who understand the science but don't believe they will suffer the consequences threaten all of us. This belief that wealth or privilege will protect them from the destruction of the masses, when we talk about the climate crisis, the crisis of our democracy, the crisis of poverty, is incredibly heretical and something that we must challenge in this election cycle, but in every day in our work. We face a fierce urgency of now, I would say, where we must change the priorities of a society which claims to be the most powerful society in history, however, doing minimal in terms of addressing these issues. Tell you a little bit about what I mean. You know, on the crisis of poverty in 1967, Dr. King first articulated this idea of a fierce urgency of now, the idea that there is such a thing as being too late. In 1967, he urged the nation to recognize that there was no time for apathy or complacency, but instead was a time for vigorous and positive action. That was over 50 years ago. 50 years later, over 50 years later, these words ring true with renewed vigor. When we look at what's at stake on poverty, before the pandemic of COVID-19, there were 140 million Americans who were poor or one life incident from being poor, living under the crushing burden of poverty before COVID-19. Before COVID-19, there were 700 people who were dying every day, not from a pandemic, but from the crushing blows of poverty. In the middle of a pandemic where we're seeing growing health costs, where tens of millions of people are not able to get the treatment they need, we see 87 million people uninsured or underinsured, 16.2 million people who have lost their employer-provided insurance, hunger costs resulting in $160 billion per year in healthcare costs for poor families, and nearly 1 in 3 Americans at risk of not being able to afford water in 5 years. On the issue of poverty, we're seeing a reality where nearly half, 46.5% of the nation is living in poverty. And these are not people who are not working. These are working poor. Sometimes people who are working multiple jobs. And then we're wrestling now with the present threat of inflation, the cost of living, the cost of housing going up. So that is a crisis. That's what's at stake. We are also sitting and facing the crisis of climate. Recognize that when we talk about the climate crisis, we know that the science is clear. Unless we slash fossil fuel emissions in half by 2030 and reach a net zero world by 2050, we will see a continuously growing, continuously devastating climate crisis. We will see the storms and the heat waves and the droughts that we call catastrophes today becoming normal events tomorrow. We'll see inequality grow and poverty deepen across the United States, but more importantly, globally, because we know that the climate crisis serves as a multiplier on deep-seated social inequity. In some speeches, I say climate serves as a multiplier on every form of social inequity that we have perfected as a society. And I say perfected because too often it's been the result of bad policy decisions. And then when we talk about the crisis of our democracy, recognize that 2016 was the first presidential election cycle that we went through as a country where we did not have the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act has still not been reinstated. So we've gone through two electoral cycles without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, meaning that by the black letter law, we have less voting rights today than we did in 1965. At the same time where we're facing these incredible societal challenges, at the same time where we're facing a demographic shift where for the first time in 2020, the potential pool of voters, so not the ones that participated, but the potential eligible voters, American voters who were millennials, outnumbered the potential pool of eligible voters who were boomers and of that generation. And not creating a ageist narrative, but that is an opportunity where we could see a narrative and a value shift. However, those individuals are seeing their voting rights suppressed. So that, when we think of that triage, the crisis of poverty, the crisis of climate, the crisis of democracy, forms this nexus of this urgency of now and this critical awareness of what is at stake in this election.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful framing for our conversation tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Mary, I want to turn to you and see what your reaction and your response to what William just shared is, and to offer any additional thoughts.
So let me too add my gratitude for being invited to join you all this evening. William laid out the perfect foundation for our conversation this evening, to which I would add, some people do not think that the midterms should be taken seriously, but they should. So much is possible if we can get a few more senators voting from a place of valuing the preservation of God's creation and our sacred earth. And we cannot understand the role, we cannot underestimate the role of local elected officials on the ground in implementing measures to protect and restore what we in the Catholic tradition call our common home. Who we elect matters on absolutely every level.
Absolutely. And I think that's the perfect segue to turn to Gayla, who, is working, in Georgia, local, state level, on the ground, organizing. And Gayla, I just want to ask you, this question about why is it important to reflect on our personal and shared faith values before we vote?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. I think for me, I really want to start my comments with understanding the fact that for me, as a person of faith, like so much of our natural environment, so much of our common home is built in, like, that's where we pray, it's where we meditate, it is where we ground ourselves. And so for me, it's important for me spiritually to understand this connection between voting and voting my values, but it's also important for me to understand the ecosystem that I'm in. So for example, if I'm someone that cares very deeply about, transportation, about making sure that people don't have high energy bills, it makes me feel better knowing that I am in line with other people that care about making sure that bills are affordable in this state. So you have the literal sense of making sure that we want to elect people that are in alignment with our values, but also just knowing that we are, whether literally or metaphorically, arm in arm with people who care very deeply about our values, who see the beauty of our natural environment and say, yes, this is worth fighting for. This is worth, standing in line for. This is worth, doing the extra research for. Like, all of it's worth it because it is something that matters very deeply to us. So I think for me, it's important, like spiritually. I just like the fact that waking up knowing that, like, oh, there are other people rooting for my collective goal, but also it's really important so that way we can see progressive change in ways that matter in, like, our material conditions.
Yeah, it matters. It matters. That's and I think making sure people understand that it matters is really important. And, Mary, you said earlier that, people don't see the midterm elections as mattering, right? They don't see the midterms as important as the presidential election years. And yet we know that every election year is actually significant. And so I just want to turn back to you and ask you, what do you think makes 2022 uniquely significant as an election year?
So I think, building on what William spoke about, our democracy is at stake. If we do not have a functioning multiracial representative democracy, then we voters who care about climate change will not have our interests represented. So we are starting to see, as we all know who have gathered here, the effects of climate change on people's lives and livelihoods, domestically and internationally. So I'm putting in the chat now a New York Times article that I commend you all to read. It's a 2020 article that is comprehensive in laying out how the great climate migration has actually already begun. I strongly recommend that you read it because one of many connections that it makes to what we're talking about this evening is how demographic decline in the US would be greatly benefited by the injection of new people into our aging workforce, while also relieving pressures on the fastest warming countries by allowing more migrants to move north across our borders, right? It says the best outcome requires not only goodwill and the careful management of turbulent political forces. Without preparation and planning, the sweeping scale of change could be widely destabilizing. So we need elected officials who are willing to do this deeper thinking and to have the courage to put measures in place now to prepare for the future. Also, late last year, the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed. And this was on the heels of millions of Americans who had felt the effects of climate change when roads were washed out, airport power goes down, schools get flooded. Last year alone, the United States faced 22 extreme weather and climate-related disaster events, with losses exceeding 1 million each, with a cumulative price tag of nearly 100 billion. People of color, of course, are more likely to live in the areas most vulnerable to this flooding and other climate change related weather events. So the bipartisan infrastructure deal last year made our communities safer and our infrastructure more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And with the investment of roughly $50 billion. So this included funds to protect against droughts and floods. In addition to major investments in weatherization, the bill is the largest investment in the resilience of physical and natural systems in American history. So we need local elected officials to take advantage of those funds that were made available in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So there's legislation all the time in Washington that makes these kinds of funds available. For example, the current reconciliation bill does not need 60 votes to get passed, just a simple majority. So we need elected officials at all levels. Again, I'm repeating myself, but there's so many possibilities these days. So yes.
Thank you. And I love that you pointed to the need for elected officials who are willing to do this kind of deep thinking, because we do seem to run only in election cycles, which doesn't really allow for that kind of forward, long range thinking, in the same way that I think, religious communities are really poised to do this long-term thinking, because how many faith communities do we know that have been in the same place for 100 or 150 years, and they're very, they're very place-based. They understand their context, and yet we've lost that way of thinking in sort of our larger society. And William, you framed our conversation so well in terms of the intersectionality of these moral issues that we're faced with. And I wonder, how might you go about talking to someone about that who is seeing these issues only in silos, and how might you connect the issues in an intersectional way to them when you're talking about them?
Thank you for the question, Susan. It's excellent. There's a concept that comes to mind in terms of the Sankofa bird, which is actually a bird that while it is flying forward, while it is looking to the future, while it is plotting that path, to the future, it looks backwards to understand, where and whence it is coming from. And so, when we talk about the intersection of these issues, I think they manifest in two ways. One, in terms of the original manifestation, of how they came to be. When we talk about the intersection of climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, and dignity for all people, I said earlier that the problems that we see are really manifestations of bad policy decisions. So I want to walk through a little bit of history. I don't hope not to be too long, but this is important. So take redlining, for example. All of us are familiar with the history of redlining, which was a policy during the New Deal era by which the federal government, in conjunction with efforts to address a national housing shortage at the time, sound familiar, developed a series of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. These were color-coded to indicate to banks where it was safe to insure mortgages, where it was safe to lend. This government policy, most of us know, had a clear racial disparity, as places where there were high populations of Blacks or immigrants lived were colored red to indicate that it was unsafe, it was risky to insure mortgages or lend in those areas. Additionally, there was a document entitled the Underwriting Manual, which established explicitly segregationist policies as a part of its recommendations, saying, and I quote, that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that Black and immigrants should not be granted access to the same loans that were helping to increase access to housing for an emerging middle class. So there's a racial disparity there that translated to an economic disparity because it had devastating long-term economic effects, including reducing in mass the opportunity for Blacks and immigrants to become homeowners, resulting in severely kneecapping the ability of these groups to accumulate wealth, which is still felt today, because when you look at the current racial wealth gap in the country, African Americans have only about 5% of the wealth as compared to their white counterparts. And most of that disparity can be directly traced back to this issue of redlining. This is actually laid out in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. I would encourage everyone to take a look at it. Now, that translates to our environmental crisis and climate justice in a number of ways. The underwriting manual that I mentioned earlier made an additional recommendation. A lot of us don't know that highways would be an effective tool in separating Black and immigrant communities from white neighborhoods. Today, highways and industrial vehicular pollution are some of the most egregious sources of greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution that is plaguing communities of color for generations. So historically, in the early 1930s, highways were preferentially constructed through Black and brown communities across the nation. Entire communities were actually bulldozed for preferred placement of our national highway system. Communities like Freedmanstown in North Dallas, Texas, like West Belford in Houston, like West Oakland in California. And that source of pollution that we know today over generations create a cycle of disproportionate exposure to pollution that is now starting to be studied. According to a recent study, Inequitable Exposure to Air Pollution by the Union of Concerned Scientists, African Americans are exposed to 34% more vehicular air pollution. Latinos are exposed to 26% more, and potentially surprisingly, Asian Americans are exposed to 36% more air pollution, many in communities that were previously redlined. It also opened the gate to community disruption and further environmental justice, because these communities that were bulldozed, these highways that were placed, served as channels of commerce along which big industry then sought to develop. So when they were looking to site the polluting assets, they looked to place operations in areas that were near these channels of commerce, near these highway systems, but also did not have the political or financial capital to offer significant resistance. This happened to be the same communities of color that were racially discriminated, who were economically kneecapped because they were not allowed to generate wealth through home ownership. And you create a vicious feedback loop of inequity that is still in place today. We see it in the fact that 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. We see it in the fact that African Americans are 75% more likely than white people to live in fence-line communities close to oil and gas infrastructure that pollutes all of our air and changes the climate for all of us. It means that in 46 US states, people of color live with more air pollution than white people. It also means, in a recent study that came out in April that looked at the connection between redlining and fossil fuel infrastructure, redline communities had a 200% increase of well and pipeline infrastructure, the same infrastructure that causes devastating climate change. And so when we talk about the intersection of these issues, it's in the reality, it's in how this manifests, it's in this feedback loop of inequity that takes root. And we have to recognize that these communities that are on the front lines, they don't just happen to be in the areas that are most vulnerable to climate change. They don't happen to just exist in the areas that are polluting, where polluting infrastructure is cited. They were forced by bad policy decision over a century ago. Now that's one way it intersects. The second way it intersects, and I close, is when we think about the solutions to that. When we think about the opportunity to transition all of us to a clean economy, to do a just transition to a clean economy, there's a quote by Van Jones that says it like this: the green economy should not just be about reclaiming throwaway stuff. It should be about reclaiming thrown away communities. It should not just be about recycling things to give them a second life. We should also be gathering up people and giving them a second chance. In other words, we should use the transition to a better energy strategy as an opportunity to create a better economy and a better country all around. And when we look at the scale of investment that's being placed into transitioning us to a clean economy, and when we look at some of the historic investments that Mary was referencing, it's a real opportunity to redress some, not all, but some of the harm that has been placed on these communities historically.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. And one of the things we're hoping that people will do, and one of the reasons we came out with this voter reflection guide, is that we want people to talk to each other about these issues and about the relationships. And we also want them to ask questions of the candidates, right? We want people to have an opportunity to hear from candidates how they will work to address these issues if they're elected. And so, Gayla, I want to turn to you, and I just wonder if you would say a word about the discussion questions and the questions for candidates that are included in this guide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for me, I want to go back to what I was saying earlier about like feeling like you are either literally or metaphorically arm in arm with folks. Like, I think for me, what's really interesting is seeing elected officials as also arm in arm with you. So for example, like what I love about this voter guide in terms of it asks questions about immigration, about restorative justice, about LGBTQ plus equality, about, making sure that when we're talking to each other, we're actually interested in inquiry. We're trying to find out about each other. And I think that's what's most fascinating, because it is one thing for me to say I am, a steward of hope. I am someone that actively wants to seek grace from people that are, in ways that I need it. Like, I think it's one way to say that. And I think it's another way to extend it to someone that is different from me. For example, me as a person of color, as a queer person, as a trans person, I don't get to fold my identities into these cute little pockets of myself. I show up as my full self in this world. And I wouldn't expect anyone else of multiple identities to, fold themselves into, pockets and things like that. So for me, it's really interesting whether we're at a kitchen table, whether, I don't know, like I'm stopping to get like ice cream or something like that, being able to have a very candid conversation, to know that if I'm someone that cares about climate, I don't have to silo that away from the fact that I'm someone that cares about immigration justice. Because like for me, when I'm looking at, you know, the Amazon is on fire, when I'm looking at a tsunami that hits Japan, when I'm looking at these different world events, I have to think about who are those people that are impacted by that and where are they going? Because, for example, I have family in Louisiana, so like if that family has to go to Texas, and I'm thinking about like the different migration and how we think about climate, I can't remove that from how I see, you know, people traveling across borders to seek safety. And so for me, if I am praying for peace, if I'm praying for safety and a hope for a better world, I have to think about all these things together and not separate. Because if I am, that means I'm not getting to the true root of these inequalities. I'm getting to kind of like the surface. I'm getting to like the tip of the iceberg. So I think, so to go back to it though, like I think what's most interesting to me for this voter guide is the fact that we're asking questions, that we are not making an assumption that, oh, you should be like this because you're like me, right? Like we're not making assumptions about who we are. We're not making assumptions about what position someone might hold. We're asking questions. So that way, when we are seeking a better future, we're doing so in a way that, you know, is in alignment with the people that are most oppressed, with the people that are impacted by the redlining, with people that are impacted by these floods that don't have the infrastructure. So yeah.
Beautiful, thank you. And it is, you know, I think there is a lot of challenge in the world right now, and certainly there's an awful lot of despair that folks are feeling, that I'm having conversations with, and I think being able to move forward, as you identify, Gayla, in a spirit of hope, really grounds us to, you know, to feel that we have a sense of agency, and to know that something that we do can make the difference. And in this case, the something we hope is voting, that we have this sense of agency, we have the power to vote, and that we need to use it. We need to get out and use that to make a difference and vote our values in the elections. And so I want to pretty quickly turn to questions from our attendees. But before we do that, I wanted to ask each of you whether your organizations have a particular call to action that you want to share with attendees this evening. It could be an action that you're asking people to take. It could be a program you'd like to point them to. But let's take a moment, because you all are doing such amazing work, and I want to give you the opportunity to share that. And so William, let's start with you this time. You know, you're involved in multiple things. So I want to just invite you to share what you'd like to see folks doing right now.
Absolutely. So in the Climate Reality Project, we have a campaign that is entitled Our Climate Moment. And there we are capitalizing on what we have said is our climate moment. We recognize that by passing bold climate legislation, as well as pro-climate executive orders and agency, we can see a successful, diverse, and dynamic coalition of stakeholders and leaders come together to not just address the climate issue, but to address those other issues of poverty, of economic injustice, of democracy, protecting our democracy that I mentioned. There are 5 pillars that we're focusing on there. One being just transition to clean energy, where we're working for policies that transition the U.S. power sector to 100% renewable electricity by 2035. 2 being zero carbon transportation. 3 being climate justice and public health. 4 being building green communities, where we're talking not just about building back, but building back better, you know, with climate smart homes and infrastructure to ensure all communities, especially those on the front line, are made sustainable for the long haul. And then pillar 5, which is protecting democracy, recognizing that the past several years have really tested the strength of our fragile democracy, you know, but that it is in this moment that we should demonstrate we are a nation for all, and we're building a better world for all. Switching hats to the Poor People's Campaign, where I'm working along with my father, Bishop William J. Barber II, and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. They are launching on June 18th a mass moral assembly in Washington, D.C. of low-wage workers and a march to the ballot box and to the polls, recognizing that this movement has to culminate in an exercising of political power that gets us the policies that we desperately need. And we, being Climate Reality, have been in strong partnership with that entity, with that movement, to have a call to action to the environmental and climate movements to recognize this a moment for all of our movements, not just one organization, but all of our movements. We're at a critical point, a tipping point for all of our movements. And to that end, we're encouraging folks, the network of, Interfaith Power and Light to show up and join us in standing in solidarity with low-wage workers from all across the nation on June 18th and making our voices and, more importantly, our issues heard, but going back and building the infrastructure that gets us to wield power in these upcoming elections.
Great. Thank you so much. And absolutely. And I know there are IPL folks who are poised to join that action on June 18th. So thanks for lifting that up. And Mary, how about network? What would you like to share in terms of a call to action from network?
Well, actually picking up significantly from what Gayla talked about, as well as William, network to get our base ready for the election. We have our grassroots mobilization team is presenting 6 workshops this summer. 2 sessions in June and July on transformative conversations to bridge divide, so we can really learn how to talk to each other. The racial wealth and income gap workshop that really fleshes out what William was talking about. A tax justice for all. We have a get out the vote program as well. I'm putting that in the chat. But of course, our folks will be there because we're here in Washington on June 18th as well, working with all the Catholic groups that are supporting the gathering then.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mary. And Gayla, how about you and Georgia IPL?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll keep mine short and sweet. I hope folks who are watching or who will see this later will join me in being either A, pledging to be a faith climate justice voter, and B, signing up to be a congregation captain. So here in Georgia, we work on federal policy, state policy, local policy. Like locally, we want cities like Decatur, Athens, there are cities that have pledged 100% renewable clean energy plans. Wonderful, great. We also work on the state level with our public service commissioners, advocating for net metering and energy efficiency. And of course, we work on the federal level. Thankfully, I'm very jealous. Reverend Hendershot got to meet, got to be in DC. Cody and Hannah got to meet Reverend Raphael Warnock. I didn't, but it's cool. It's fine. I'm not sad about it. But I think any ways that we can get more people of faith, more faith leaders engaged in politics, engaged in what is happening at all these different levels of government, what is happening in our communities is really significant. If you flip a switch in the state of Georgia, you should know where that energy comes from, and you should not have to, decide if you want food or medicine in order to get that energy. And so I really urge folks to become a congregation captain, because our congregations can be really big, they can be really small, though all it takes is one person to say, hey, y'all, are we registered to vote? Are we paying attention to redistricting? Are we being civically engaged? All it takes is one person, and we're here to make sure you have the tools and the training to make sure that you can be successful in doing so. So I really encourage folks to be a congregation captain.
Thank you. Yeah, shout out to the congregation captains who might be joining us on the webinar tonight. And we know we just appreciate your local leadership so much as we do this work together. And we know that congregations are going to be using this guide in a number of different ways. So here are just a few ways that we wanted to share with you. Certainly social media, including it in your newsletter. Use it in a discussion group. Of course, we said we have these great questions embedded within the guide that you can use. Order print copies to distribute in your place of worship. You can offer it alongside voter registration and social services in your congregation. And of course, using the questions and candidate forums and sharing the information via a link or a slide in your worship service. And we also want to invite you who are joining us tonight to just drop in the chat other ideas that you have or other ways that you plan to use the guide so that we can share some information and some ideas with one another. So please feel free to drop that information into the chat as well. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Mike Kennedy, our IPL Faith Climate Justice Voter Campaign Manager. And he's going to share some questions from attendees this evening with our panelists. Thank you, Mike.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you. We've had several good questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, but let's get started with one. And I think I'm going to direct this one to Mary. And it's prefaced with a statement from Lisa, who asked it. She said, short-term thinking is influencing the poor decisions made by politicians. How do we get politicians to focus longer than the next election?
That is an incredibly excellent question. And we, as William was speaking about, this is a moment in time for pernicious polarization in our Congress. And so I don't know how we overcome this except by electing members or at the local level and the state level who really care about values and who are willing to be courageous. Right now, even in the face of the terrible gun violence that we have experienced in this country in the last month, we still had people voting on partisan lines. And so we have to shore up the Voting Rights Act, absolutely the way William spoke about. We have to get people at all levels of our governments so that we can work together to do this. And we have to start talking to each other. That's the other work that we're doing in our political ministry, is behind the scenes, we're getting staffs and members to start talking to each other, because that has broken down significantly. And as we gear up in 10 minutes for the January 6th hearings, right? I hope they can be done in a way that helps us come together and heal from it once we actually look it in the face of what actually happened and the evil at work on January 6th, which I hope was the culmination of this breaking apart of our democracy. But it's endemic of how fragile it is right now. And so it is a pivotal election. It's a pivotal time. Don't want to be doomsday, but it's an important moment for everyone to be showing up.
Thank you. We received this question from a Facebook viewer, and William, since you mentioned redlining in your comments, I think I'll address this question to you, and it's prefaced with a brief introduction from the person who asked it. The person said, Dr. King made the ultimate sacrifice for our vote. I'm white and benefit from privilege, but right now I'm extremely low income. And then thinking about others asks, how do we reverse redlining's effects on the Black community, giving the ones who have lost faith in voting reason to vote?
I think that's an excellent question, and, Mike, one piece that I would say is that there has to always be an organic, nonpartisan grassroots movement that is continuing to put the lens and hold politicians' feet to the fire on these issues. Whether they're Republican, Democrat, or independent, there has to be a movement of the people of the issues that always exists. And I'm thankful for those on the call who are part of that. One of the statistics that I think is important for us to think about in building the political groundswell where we could actually move policy forward is that, in the 2016 presidential election, there were 138 million voters out of 225 million eligible voters. 29 million of those voters were poor or low income, and there were an additional 34 million poor or low income people who were eligible, but who did not vote. And low income people vote about 20% percentage points lower than higher income voters, because the main reason being reported is that there was a lack of interest in the issues and feeling that their vote did not matter. So people felt like they were not being talked to. There's untapped power in these communities, in poor African-American communities, poor brown communities, poor white communities, where largely the issues manifest in many of the same ways. So we have to be sure that there's a movement that is calling the general political discourse to speak to that reality and to not write off the realities of millions of Americans. Only then can we actually build the political groundswell to move policy on poverty, on redressing the effects of racial segregation, on climate. So when we talk about speaking to the intersection of these issues and these intersectional movements, it's not just a matter of being the morally correct thing to do, not just that it feels good. It's a matter of political necessity. And so that is what I suggest, is that we have to be very intentional about building that grassroots, nonpartisan movement that holds all of us to the fire in the urgency of these issues.
Thank you, William. And thank you to those who asked questions and the panelists for answering them. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, who's going to share with you some ways that you can help.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. I just want to say we absolutely need your help to get this this voter guide out through your networks. And so we want to share a few ways that you can help. One way, of course, is to share it on social media. We are sharing content on both our Twitter and Facebook accounts right now, and we've dropped some things into the chat for you. So please retweet and share this so that we can get this this guide out far and wide to all of our networks. Again, we encourage you to use the guide in your congregation's activities. It is available now digitally on our website, and soon print copies will be available for you at a small cost as well, that you can share physical copies with your family, friends, neighbors, loved ones, congregation members, everyone that you know. We encourage you to share those. We also want you to check your registration status or register to vote if you are not already registered. So we are partnering with When All Vote, and there is a link getting dropped in the chat where you can go in and check your registration status or register to vote. And we encourage you to do that, and to also share that information with those in your circle to make sure that they are prepared to go out to the polling places. We want you, again, as Gayla mentioned, to pledge to be a faith, climate, justice voter. Take the pledge and then invite your friends and family and faith community to also take the pledge. And the chat is, we're sharing the link in the chat for that as well. You can certainly donate to power the Faith, Climate, Justice voter campaign. And additionally, I would encourage you to donate to any of the 3 amazing organizations that are our partners here this evening. And so we know that it takes funding to do this work. And so we will shamelessly plug the fact that we do rely on your gifts and your donations in order to be able to reach more people and bring more people into this important movement. You can certainly also volunteer as a congregation captain. As a captain, you'll be a lead for your faith community with the Faith, Climate, Justice voter campaign, and we will be providing you extra information through that program as we go through the campaign season and how you and your faith community can be involved. And we certainly encourage you as faith leaders to give a sermon or a chat on the importance of voting to your religious community. It's really important for folks to understand how protecting our democracy and voting your values is a part of creating the world that we want to see. And you can learn more about the entire campaign at our campaign website. We're going to drop that link in the chat for you as well, faithclimatejusticevoter.org. And you can find a lot more information at that website. And so finally, in closing, I want to thank you all for attending this evening and being a part of this important conversation and the work that you are doing to reach people in your community, in your faith community, your friends and neighbors, your family members. We know that this is important to you, or you would not be with us this evening. And so we're so grateful for your time and the energy that you're putting into this. Of course, I want to thank our three amazing panelists that we had this evening, William Barber III, Mary Novak, and Gayla Tillman. Thank you for your time and your wisdom. It was just an amazing conversation. I only wish that we had more time together, because I feel like it was just the tip of the iceberg here. And I also want to thank our amazing IPL team for pulling the webinar together, and for all the work on the Faith Climate Justice Voter Campaign and on this voter guide that we're sharing. It's a lot of work, and it takes a team to pull it all together, and we're really grateful for all of you. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and blessings on the journey.